Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Dr. Jessica Bikaun, and I am a research scientist with the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. I have been a honeybee specialist for the department before, so they thought that it would be a good idea for me to give you an overview of the red dwarf honeybee and what we're doing about it. So before I begin today, I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the country, the Aboriginal people of the many lands that I'm very lucky to work on, and their language groups throughout Western Australia, I recognise their strength and connection to the land and waters and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And today I'm very lucky to be presenting from Karratha, which is Ngarluma country. So today I'm going to be covering 4 frequently asked questions that we get about the response, and these are: what is red dwarf honeybee? What's the problem? What's DPIRD doing about it? And how can we help? So to start off with, what is the red dwarf honeybee? The red dwarf honeybee, also known as Apis florea, is one of 2 dwarf honeybee species. It's 7 to 10 millimetres in length, which means that it's much smaller than the European honeybees. This little bee is black and grey towards its head end, and the back end of it is quite distinctive with this red colour, which hopefully you can see my pointer, this red colour and its black and white banding. Now, all honeybees are social creatures. That means that they live in a colony that has one queen. This is the reproductive female with thousands of workers. These are sterile females. So if you ever thought that the workers were boys, I hate to break it to you, but they are females. And hundreds of drones. These are the males, which occur seasonally in a colony. So as you can see, again, they are very much a smaller bee than our regular European honeybees that we're used to seeing in our gardens. The honeybee nest structure for these little bees is quite different to what we're used to with the European honeybees. So the dwarf bees, they create a single vertical comb that extends around a branch, whereas the other types of honeybees that are out in the world, such as giant honeybees, which we don't have in Australia, and the cavity nesting bees, which are our European honeybees. So typically we find our European honeybees in cavities such as tree hollows or even in caves, whereas for the dwarf honeybees, they can be found basically anywhere that there is a structure they can build from. What does a nest actually look like? If you were to find a nest in the open, this is what you would see. So this is one that we collected from the Burrup Peninsula last year. What the nest is composed of is typically a crown, which is the top part around the branch. This is where the bees actually store their honey, and they use it as a dance platform. So the little bees go on top of this crown area and they actually dance in the direction of floral resources. So next we have a bit of a pollen source. This is the protein source for honeybees. And then below that is where the developing bees, the brood, the larvae and the pupae are actually stored. And this is where they're developing in the comb. Now, these are the worker brood cells, and below that we have these larger brood cells which are for the drones or male bees. And below that, in a mature colony, we also find some reproductive queen cells. So you're probably wondering, where are we likely to find these nests? Unfortunately, because these bees have such basic requirements for building a nest around any kind of horizontal structure, the number of sites available to an Apis florea swarm is virtually limitless, which has been reported by people that study these bees. So these are some beautiful photos taken by Dr. James Mackinson from the University of Sydney, and he has shown us that these bees, they can be found obviously out in the wild in the shrubs and trees in Thailand, but they're also quite comfortable with building structures from human objects and even off the side of buildings, so not even around a branch per se. This means that finding nests take time, and we can't accurately predict where they will nest, but the thing is they can't either. Normally in honeybees, they reach a bit of a consensus before they actually take flight, usually an hour or two before the swarm of bees decides to move to a new location, and they will all be dancing in the one direction. Unfortunately, with these bees, they will actually be dancing in very different directions right up until the minute that they leave the mother nest to go and build a new colony. So it's very difficult for us to predict where they're going to go because they can't really predict it either. But so far we've found them in trees like this Kurrajong tree to the right, but also down in dense acacia shrubs too on the Burrup. So what's the problem? You might be thinking to yourself, I thought we were trying to save the bees, so why are we trying to get rid of these bees? The problem is that red dwarf honeybee is a very impressive invader and hitchhiker. It's highly tolerant and has been known to be around the Persian Gulf, where it's regularly over 50 degrees Celsius and no other honeybees can actually survive there. So they're highly tolerant, they are quite adept at invading new environments, and they obviously have these very basic requirements. So they're not at all opposed to starting afresh in a new location. We also know that they're highly invasive. So they have a native range throughout Southeast Asia, but they have become invasive through their own making, just natural spread, and also human-mediated spread, where they are stowing away on different vessels. Unfortunately, with this tiny little bee, they are very small, obviously, and they also are not very aggressive, which means that they are very good at hitchhiking. They can go easily undetected on ships and in containers, which is how it's likely to have spread so far around the globe. The red dwarf honeybee invasiveness compared to the European honeybee is quite impressive. So these little bees, they are known to be migratory. They will actually abandon old nests and go searching for better resources, and that includes shade in summer and also warmth in winter. So they are known to migrate. That means that they can cover quite large distances very easily if the resources that they're using disappear. They're also quite different to European honeybees in that they have non-hostile queens. Normally, when a European honeybee colony is going through a swarming event, which is where the bees are producing new queens, which will start a new colony, those queens are quite aggressive to each other. And the first queen to hatch, the first virgin queen, will go around and she will actually chew down the cells of the other queens and sting any other queens to death. But in these red dwarf honeybees, they're actually not hostile towards each other. In a normal red dwarf honeybee nest, they can actually produce 12 to 16 queen cells in a normal swarming event, and each of these can leave the parent colony to go and start a new colony. So here are some more pictures. We have a drone. This is the male red dwarf honeybee in the top left, and also a queen who's kind of buried by some of her workers, but just a little bit bigger than her worker bees. The other main problem that we have with red dwarf honeybees is that they are massive competitors for our native bees and also the European honeybees, which is an important plant industry for us. So in terms of competition, these bees are obviously very invasive, and their tiny body size means that they are quite interested in resources that have typically been uninteresting to the bigger European honeybees before. This means that they will basically go for any pollen or nectar resource in the landscape. They're not at all fussy, and it means that they'll be massive competitors with our lovely native bees, such as this blue-banded bee on the left or the Dawson's burrowing bee on the right. We also know that these bees are raiders of European honeybees. They're quite naughty. They're a bit like chihuahuas of the bee world, where they will go for the bigger bees and they will actually attack honeybee hives, the European honeybee hives, to steal resources from them. So this could be a major problem for our beekeeping industry in Western Australia, and it can also lead to other crossover that's happening. These bees, the red dwarf honeybees, are known to carry a number of exotic pests and diseases that we really don't want to have here in Western Australia or Australia in general. And these include things like a Euvarroa mite, the Tropilelaps mites, which are a fast-running mite, and also viruses. So this is a picture of deformed wing virus, again, exotic to Australia. Now, luckily in this response, the viral testing that has been done showed that the red dwarf honeybees have not brought in any exotic viruses, but they are carrying a Euvarroa mite. The Euvarroa mite that they are carrying is Euvarroa sinhai. This little mite is about 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, so a little bit smaller than a poppy seed. It's brown and pear-shaped. It isn't to be confused with the Varroa mite, though. The Varroa mite you may have heard of through the honeybee industry on the eastern states. There was an incursion of Varroa that has now become established in New South Wales, but this is a very different species of mite. So the Euvarroa mite are only known to parasitize dwarf honeybees. This is a picture to scale showing how big the mite is compared to the dwarf honeybee and also our European honeybees. But Euvarroa does pose a potential threat. So there have been lab studies on Euvarroa for European honeybees, and they've shown that the mites are able to successfully reproduce on our European bees, but there is a lower mite survival rate. The problem, though, is that these mites, when they were successful at reproducing, they had a much faster reproductive rate than Varroa. Typically for Varroa, for one female mite that is reproductive age that enters a honeybee larvae cell, when she leaves that cell at the end of the honeybee development, she will usually take 2, possibly 3 reproductive female mites with her that will then go out to colonize other cells. For the Euvarroa, what they saw was that the mites were able to produce and leave the cell with 1 to 8 mites per worker bee of the European honeybees. So while we haven't seen this in the wild and we don't think that it's going to happen, we do need to be quite cautious that this could be a potential threat to our European honeybee population. Now, mites, whether it's Euvarroa or Varroa, are a bad story for bees. They do a lot of damage to bees because they feed on their vital organs, in particular an organ called the fat body. The fat body is quite important for being able to metabolize pesticides and keeping the bee healthy overall. It also, the damage that the mites do, it also reduces the lifespan of the bee and the health of the bee. And this can be also through transmitting viruses. Mites are well known to be carrying viruses themselves and spreading those between colonies. It can also then lead to a loss of reproductive colonies, either through the colonies dying or through the colonies being sick, so then they aren't going to be as productive at pollinating or producing honey as they normally would be. So what's DPIRD doing about the red dwarf honeybee? The field surveillance, what it looks like is this is the beautiful country that we're in, but this is what it looks like. Hopefully you can see on the screen there are a few tiny people in the distance, and that is our field team standing by a shrub that actually had a nest of red dwarf honeybee. So this slightly darker patch in the middle photo is where the red dwarf honeybee nest is, and after getting a closer look, you can actually see that the nest is quite large, and this is the nest after we removed it. So we have field teams that are going out on foot looking for bees. This means looking for any flying insect and checking that they are in fact not red dwarf honeybee, or if they are, trying to check that there isn't a nest close by. This is obviously grueling work, particularly in this heat, this time of year. So we really appreciate all of the hard work from our field staff and all of the assistance that we've received from the stakeholders in the area. DPIRD have declared a quarantine area for the red dwarf honeybee. This is for the entire Burrup Peninsula. Now, this means that for the quarantine area, you're not permitted to move bees, nests, beehives, or hive components out of the quarantine area. It also means that you cannot tamper with, disturb, interfere with the red dwarf honeybee or wild European honeybee nests. And we also require that if you do come across a red dwarf honeybee nest or a wild European honeybee nest, or even foraging bees, that you report these to our department within 48 hours. This is to ensure that we can get some field teams on the ground in the area and try to find those nests as quickly as possible, because as we now know, these bees are highly invasive, so time is of the essence. What else is DPIRD doing in this space? Well, We also have an apiary biosecurity and surveillance team that regularly conducts surveillance around Western Australia. The team, they regularly inspect the sentinel hives. So these are beehives that are set up and then regularly tested for mites, viruses, and also checking for anything else exotic that may turn up in a hive. These hives are positioned around the state at the major ports. So these ports, they include Derby Port, and then moving further south, we have Geraldton, Fremantle, Kwinana, Bunbury, Albany, and Esperance. Now, these ports were set up under the National Bee Pest Surveillance Program, which now only covers Fremantle, Bunbury, and Geraldton, and the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development have decided to continue having sentinel hives at the other ports. But these are obviously the key ports that DPIRD is doing surveillance on, but that doesn't mean that surveillance isn't being done elsewhere in the state. We also have the Federal Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry that also do surveillance for exotic bees and mites. But the apiary inspections are also happening regularly throughout the state to look for bee surveillance. But we need beekeepers on board with this as well. So how can you help? So number one is to report all suspected red dwarf honeybees. This means keeping an eye out for bees on flowering plants like this acacia in the top left, or water sources. With the heat at the moment, particularly this week, we're seeing that bees are drawing closer to water sources. So you may come across a water source where there are both European honeybees like this one here and red dwarf honeybees like this one. This doesn't necessarily need to be a natural water source. So if you are on the Burrup and you have a leaky air conditioner, please go and check your air conditioner to see if there are any bees outside collecting water from it. We're also urging you to have a look in trees and shrubs. If you're an avid bushwalker around the Burrup, please keep an eye out in case you come across another tree like this currajong with a big nest of bees in it, or also on the ground. But it's also worth paying attention to infrastructure too. So there could be some infrastructure like this where there is a little colony of bees starting to make a nest there. So keep an eye out on everything and anything, and report all suspected sightings of the red dwarf honeybee to either My Pest Guide. This is a free app, which I'll talk about in a moment. And please report to My Pest Guide, even if you don't manage to get a photo, or call our Pest and Disease Information Services. The other thing that we would really appreciate is if stakeholders can continue to assist with site access and red dwarf honeybee awareness. So the Burrup Peninsula, particularly the industrial site, has a vast number of stakeholders and plenty of restricted sites because of the industrial nature and the work that's happening there. So we really appreciate all of the access assistance that the groups have helped us with, and even the surveillance work that some of the staff have been able to provide as well. But really we need all eyes looking. So we have field teams out at the moment, but we would appreciate it if all of the staff that you have on the Burrup are continuing to look for these little bees and their quite sneaky nests. But thank you so much for your ongoing cooperation and support in this area. This is a challenging response, and we know that we have a lot of work to do, so we appreciate your support.